My wife left hand in hand with her boss at the end of the couple's party, and I didn't make a fuss. I didn't shout, I didn't question, I didn't ask for an explanation. I simply walked up to them, took the ring I had discreetly slipped off my finger minutes earlier from my pocket, and handed it to her, looking only into her eyes, ignoring his presence. I said, with the calm that only deep disappointment can command, "I don't need this anymore." I turned away without waiting for a response. There ended a story she'd chosen to abandon. And in that moment, for the first time, I felt what it was like to be completely alone, even surrounded by people. I never thought the end of a love would begin so quietly. There were no tears at that moment. Not hers, not mine. Just a thick silence that accompanied me to the car, home, and even the nights that followed. The silence of someone who knew what they had lost, but who still didn't fully grasp the depth of the hole that loss would leave. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional, it was mental, it was cruel. It happened first in secret glances, then in muffled laughter in the hallways, until it turned into touching, desire, and finally, abandonment. What hurt most wasn't the act itself, but the process, watching, from the front row, someone I loved slip away every day, while I did everything I could to hold her close. While I still chose her every day, she no longer saw me. I remember the day I found out. It wasn't the hidden kiss, nor the belated confession. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a smile she gave him during a get-together with friends. A smile that had once been mine, but no longer belonged to me. It was no longer the smile of someone in love with me, but rather of someone who desired another man in front of me. And when they left the party hand in hand, the confirmation didn't destroy me, it only sealed a slow process of erosion. Betrayal never starts with a kiss. It starts when someone stops looking at you the way they used to. I spent days without sleep, trying to understand where I had gone wrong. Had I failed as a man? Had I failed to listen, to notice, to touch? But, over time, I understood that the mistake wasn't mine. The mistake was hers in not talking, in not fighting, in not saying something was wrong. The mistake was hers in choosing the shortcut, in seeking in fleeting desire an escape from the tedium of routine. Because love doesn't die, it is murdered, and there are always fingerprints on the crime. And hers were on every detail. I kept the pain to myself for a while. No one needs to see the depth of our suffering. I put on fake smiles, said okay when asked, and tried, for a few weeks, to pretend life was going on as normal. But her absence in the details of the day, in the scent of the pillow, in the pairs of glasses, and in the memories stuck to the walls, screamed. Until one day, tired of so much pretending, I decided to erase her name from me. I started with the house, I threw away the photos, hid the objects, rearranged the furniture. Then I deleted the messages, the songs that were ours, the perfume she wore. But what hurt the most, I couldn't erase, the memory of who she was to me. The look in her eyes when she still loved me. Time passed. Not in the cliched way they say, with healing and lightness, but in the real way, pushing, dragging, forcing. I moved on not because I wanted to, but because the pain left me no choice. One day, I met someone. Someone serene, firm, silent. Someone who didn't promise the world, but delivered presence. Who didn't make speeches about love, but demonstrated it in small gestures. For the first time in a long time, I slept peacefully next to someone. And then I understood, trust is not negotiable. Love is not a performance. And fidelity is the greatest form of respect someone can offer another. With her, I relearned how to breathe. To smile without fear of being betrayed the next day. To believe, once again, that love could be safe. Years passed. I no longer thought of her with anger or pain, I thought of her with distance. A name that had once been home and was now merely an echo. Until a handwritten envelope arrived in the mail. Inside, a long letter. Blurred words, hesitant lines, unanswered questions. She asked for forgiveness. She said she regretted it. That what she had with him was an illusion. That she missed what we were, what she had destroyed. That she still thought of me, and that if I still had space, perhaps I could forgive her. I reread the letter 3 times. I didn't cry. I just felt the weight of someone who arrived late. I took from the bottom of a drawer a small package I had saved on the day of our separation. It was the gift she had bought me before cheating on me, an expensive watch, engraved on the back with the phrase, "With you, time is worth it." A gift never delivered because she got involved with someone else before the date arrived. I had discovered the gift by accident, after she left, among her things. And I kept it. I kept it to remind myself how forgotten I had been. I took this watch, put it in the same box it came in, and sent it back with a short note, "With me, time has moved on. May you now find your way." Nothing more. No drama. No second chances. Because sometimes, the only thing we can offer those who broke us, is silence. And it was in that moment, when she held in her hands that watch she'd never been able to give me, that the penny dropped. That she understood that no gift in this world can rewrite the past. That some choices carry weight, and some mistakes cannot be undone. That there are loves that never return, because they've already blossomed in other gardens. And what she felt in that moment, no one knows. But I know what I felt, peace. But what she did after all this, no one expected. And that's when the story took a turn that not even time would have dared to predict. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or justified. The stories you will hear are fiction, but inspired by real pain, because cheating is destroying trust, it is tearing apart love and leaving scars that time does not always heal. Our objective is clear, to show, through intense narratives, how betrayal can ruin lives and leave scars forever. Get ready now for a story shocking, unexpected and deeply emotional. Take a deep breath, and listen with your heart. They met on an ordinary autumn afternoon, when the world seemed to slow down so that two silent souls could finally meet. He, Daniel, was a man with a rare serenity in his eyes, the kind that can only be learned with time. Someone who, even young, had already understood that love wasn't about talking, it was about caring, about noticing the details no one else saw, about knowing when to be silent and when to reach out. He worked in urban planning, a profession that required foresight and attention to the present, two qualities he also brought to his relationships. He was never one for grand gestures or theatrical promises. He preferred small signs, remembering a favorite flower, noticing the tired tone in a voice, offering silence when the other's soul was too heavy for words. He was a centered man, soft-spoken, who chose his affections carefully, and when he did, he gave himself completely. Her name was Laura. And, unlike him, she seemed to carry the world on her shoulders and in her eyes. She had a gentle restlessness, a constant desire to feel, to explore, to push her own limits. With a degree in marketing, she worked at a large events and communications company, where her brilliance was impossible to ignore. She was one of those people who would walk into a room and make everything revolve around her charisma, but behind her self-confidence lay well-guarded weaknesses. Laura thirsted for intensity, and perhaps that's why, when Daniel appeared with his calm and firm demeanor, she felt that, for the first time, she could rest her heart. It was as if everything she sought outside herself was in that man with his discreet gestures and constant presence. He gave her grounding, direction, and, above all, security. The beginning was almost cinematic. A meeting that turned into coffee, that turned into a long conversation, that became a habit. When they realized it, they no longer knew what it was like to live without that daily presence. They were different in many ways, but they found harmony precisely in this. She showed him the world in brighter colors, he gave her breath back when everything seemed too much. Over time, Sundays began to taste like a cake in the oven, shared series on the couch, and whispered plans before bed. The apartment where they decided to live together was small, but full of meaning. Every corner held a story, a beginning, a memory. The picture frame on the shelf with their first trip, the magnet on the fridge of a destination they still dreamed of visiting, the sofa worn from late nights when neither of them wanted to go to bed first. Life as a couple, however, also brought the weight of choices. Laura had a rising career, increasing demands, travel, and late meetings. Daniel understood, always understood. He never complained, just asked if she needed anything, if she wanted him to make dinner, if he could pick her up later. He felt pride in watching her grow, but also, little by little, a silent twinge of distance that crept between them without him knowing exactly when it began. It wasn't a lack of love, it was excessive fatigue, it was routine, it was real life taking its toll. Even with the challenges, there was still a lot of affection, respect, and mutual admiration. Conversations still flowed, hugs were still sincere, but the time they once shared began to be taken up by demands, goals, and deadlines. Still, he persisted. He made her breakfast on Saturdays when she had to leave early. He wrote little notes and left them next to her toothbrush. He brought books he thought she would enjoy. Laura, in turn, tried to reciprocate, but increasingly seemed to be swallowed up by the whirlwind of commitments. And what was once presence became adaptation. Friends noticed. Some commented cautiously that she always seemed distracted, distant. Daniel responded lightly, saying it was just a phase. And, in a way, he believed it. He didn't doubt her. He trusted her. He knew who she was, knew the heart that beat behind that strong woman. He never imagined that the absence of time could corrode something so solid. And if there was one thing he did masterfully, it was wait. Wait for her to come back early. Wait for her to remember their anniversary without him having to tell her. Ask how he was before talking about their next meeting. But he didn't demand. Because, for Daniel, true love didn't demand, it waited, it stayed, it believed. The years passed, and with them came important achievements for both. They bought a bigger apartment, took a dream trip, and adopted a puppy. Photos on social media still showed smiles, toasts, and moments of celebration. But the truth is that, inside the house, the silences began to last longer than the conversations. They still slept together, but rarely went to bed at the same time. They still kissed when they left, but without the intensity of the early days. And although her body was there, Daniel felt that, little by little, her soul was already inhabiting another place. But he remained silent. Not out of fear of the answer, but out of loyalty to the promise he made to himself, to fight until the end. Laura, on the other hand, lived at an increasingly frenetic pace. Events, projects, new contacts, everything seemed to grow at a rate she couldn't control. She began to frequent different circles, corporate dinners, and more frequent business trips. She spoke enthusiastically about new challenges and the people she met, but she almost never asked about Daniel's days. Not out of malice, but out of distraction. Perhaps because she was trying to fill something she didn't even know was missing. Sometimes, when she looked at him, she felt guilty for being absent, but she didn't know how to rekindle the bond they had before. And deep down, she feared he would notice this internal change she couldn't explain. Despite this, there was still genuine affection. On birthdays, she made a point of preparing something special. On important dates, she made an effort to be present. But on ordinary days, her absence began to weigh heavily. Daniel didn't say it, but he felt it. And this silent feeling began to leave its mark. They weren't fights, arguments, or insults. They were gestures that stopped happening, glances that were averted, words that were spared. Love, once an active verb, became a passive noun. One day, Laura came home to find Daniel in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. The music was low, wine glasses on the table, and a white envelope tucked under the napkin. As she sat down, she smiled in surprise. He explained, in his calm voice, that it was just a gift, no special occasion, just because he felt like it. She opened the envelope and found a handwritten card. Just so you know, being with you is still my favorite part of the day. She thanked him with a light kiss, but seemed more preoccupied with a call she needed to return. He smiled anyway. Because love, for him, meant continuing even when the return seemed less likely. The gift, which was kept in the bedroom, she didn't see that night. She asked them to leave it for the next day. And the next day never came. Deep down, Daniel knew something was changing. But, like many who truly love, he chose not to believe it. He preferred to think it was a phase, that he was tired, that it was just life. I didn't want to be invasive or suffocating. He still saw her through the eyes of someone who believes in a new beginning. And so he continued, even when the space between them seemed to grow, even when the bed seemed too wide, even when the silences began to hurt more than any harsh words. The stage was set. The characters were formed. Time, relentless, would continue to take its toll. But, until then, no one knew what would come next. Not Daniel, not Laura. Because what happens when a love begins to fade isn't immediate. It's slow, it's subtle, it's almost imperceptible. And it was in this silent rhythm, in this rhythm between affection and oblivion, that the story began to change. No screams. No ruptures. Just the distant sound of something breaking, even though no one was ready to hear it yet. Laura was moving at a fast pace that seemed to show no signs of slowing down. The weeks passed in a blur, and the days rushed by amid appointments, deliveries, endless calls, and sleepless nights. There was a constant urgency in her eyes, as if something was pressing on her from within and without. She said it was work, that the new projects were demanding too much, that the company was entering a phase of expansion, and that her presence was crucial in everything. Daniel listened, understood, as he always did, but this time, something was different. A detail difficult to name, but easy to sense. Her time seemed to have been completely reallocated, and he, silently, was being left out of everything. When he tried to propose a dinner for two, she said she was exhausted. When he asked about her day, he received vague answers, lacking the same enthusiasm as before. She was there, but at the same time so distant, as if living on another frequency, another dimension. And even realizing this, Daniel insisted on the small gestures, as if he could, with them, sew back together the bond that was slowly falling apart. One random Friday, while organizing some drawers in his home office, Daniel found the gift she'd never given him. The box was still intact, wrapped with a discreet bow, and inside was a small card, unsigned, just a phrase engraved on the back of the watch, "With you, time is worth it." He stood there, holding the object for long minutes, as if trying to decipher the time that had passed between the affection contained in that choice and the abandonment that seemed to grow with each passing day. It was a reminder that, at some point, she'd still cared enough to choose something like that. And yet, she'd never given it to him. Maybe she'd forgotten. Maybe she'd put it off. Or maybe she'd decided it no longer made sense. He didn't mention the gift. He simply put it back in the same place, like someone filing away a still open wound, and went back to his day as if nothing had happened. As the weeks passed, some changes became more evident. Laura was more vain, more selective about what she wore to work, more concerned with details she'd previously ignored. He said he needed to maintain a good image for clients and superiors. He began arriving increasingly late, sometimes claiming last-minute meetings or happy hours to keep the networking going. Daniel, even feeling the growing discomfort of these absences, didn't question it. He believed that trust was demonstrated through practice, not through demands. And besides, he preferred to think it was really just work. But deep down, there was a rumbling, an uneasiness that grew every time she left in a hurry and returned without many details about where she'd been or who she'd been with. One late afternoon, she mentioned a corporate event the following Saturday, a couple's dinner hosted by the company. She said it was important, that the boss wanted everyone to be there, with their dates. Daniel accepted the invitation naturally, though he knew something about it didn't seem spontaneous. That week, she was unusually attentive. She cooked dinner 2 days in a row, bought him a new shirt for the event, and spent more time looking into his eyes than she had in months. It was as if she were trying to balance something inside herself. And this, more than calming him, put him on edge. The event took place in an elegant space with soft lighting, background music, and impeccable service. Laura looked stunning. She wore a long, dark, flowing dress, her hair sophisticatedly tied back, and wore a striking perfume he didn't recognize. Throughout the evening, she smiled too much, laughed too loudly, touched her boss's arm frequently, and spoke enthusiastically about things Daniel barely knew existed. The two seemed to share an intimacy built over days he never knew existed. Although he felt out of place, Daniel tried to maintain his composure. He greeted her colleagues, complimented the atmosphere, and smiled when necessary. But deep inside him, there was an almost unbearable unease, as if he were witnessing something nameless but with form. As if he were watching something slip through his fingers, unable to stop it. At the end of the night, as the couples began to say their goodbyes, Daniel had to go to the bathroom. It wasn't long, but long enough that, upon returning, he noticed something that knocked the breath out of his lungs. Laura was walking toward the exit, hand in hand with her boss. They weren't laughing, or talking. They were just walking, silently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She didn't look back. She didn't look for him. She didn't wait for him. It was as if he wasn't there. And it was at that moment that everything shattered inside him, but without scandal, without loss of control. Just the sharp crack of a painful certainty. He walked toward them, still as calm as ever, and without saying a word more than necessary, he took the ring he'd removed from his finger in the bathroom from his pocket and handed it to her. He looked her straight in the eyes and said, in a firm, calm voice, yet filled with a silent pain tearing at his core, that he didn't need it anymore. And then he turned away, not waiting for an answer. Not giving room for excuses, justifications, or tears. He simply left, leaving behind something he'd spent years trying to save. The feeling as he got into the car was strange. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hate. It was a deep, sharp pain that didn't scream, but gnawed at him. He wasn't thinking about their clasped hands, their knowing look, or the meaning of that gesture. He thought only of everything he'd given and how, in the end, it hadn't been enough. There was a mixture of failure and liberation inside him, as if the ground had collapsed, and at the same time, he knew he could now rebuild on a real foundation, without illusions. Laura, for her part, stood still. Daniel's words echoed louder than any shout could have. The boss beside her asked if she was okay, but she didn't answer. She just held the ring in her hands, motionless, unable to look up. It was as if everything had suddenly gone into slow motion. What she had done could not be undone. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the full weight of the choice she had made, even if she still didn't have the courage to admit it to herself. Daniel spent the next few days in silence. He didn't respond to her messages or phone calls. He didn't try to find out anything else. He began to sleep little, eat less, and walk the streets with slow steps. He still didn't know what to do with the pain, but he also didn't feel like he wanted to go back. Inside him, a wound was beginning to burn with no return. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was the realization that the love he'd given so zealously had found no refuge. And that hurt more than any physical infidelity. It was as if everything he'd been during those years had been discarded for something momentary, for a fleeting desire, for an impulse. What Laura did after that, he didn't know. And at that moment, it didn't matter either. Because something inside him had died that night, something he could never resurrect. But what he didn't yet know was that everything he felt was just the beginning. Because there was more. Much more. And what was yet to come, would completely change the meaning of everything he had experienced up until that point. The days stretched out like an endless winter. Daniel had distanced himself from everything that reminded him of Laura, but memories don't obey the desire to forget. They infiltrate the small routines, the smells of the hallway, the silence of the room, and even the sound of the wind against the window. Still, he didn't seek her out. Not a message. Not a word. Just her absence. And it was this absence that rebuilt him. Little by little, the space she'd left began to be filled by other presences, other conversations, other voices. He began to walk new places, meet new people, laugh again. Time didn't heal, but it did organize the pain into a quieter place. One afternoon, he met a calm woman, with serene eyes and a sweet voice. A connection that began slowly, without exposed wounds, without pressure. Something light, genuine. It wasn't a rescue, it was a new beginning. And Daniel allowed himself to. Not out of revenge, not out of pride, but because he understood he was still capable of loving, in a new, more mature, more attentive way. He learned to love more wisely. And this time, he loved her back. Meanwhile, Laura sank into a regret that was like quicksand. She tried to move on, tried to make it seem like everything was fine. But the emptiness swallowed her little by little. Her relationship with her boss, which at first seemed like an exciting escape, revealed itself to be what it always was, shallow. Fragile. A broken mirror. Conversations became mechanical, his interest in her vanished as quickly as it had arisen. It was as if, now that he had her, there was nothing left to conquer. She tried to hold on for a while, but the truth was inescapable, she had traded something whole for a moment of vanity. She looked at the apartment, at the perfume forgotten in the closet, at the ring tucked away in the back of the drawer, and felt a pain that no professional achievement could erase. Daniel's absence was the greatest burden in her daily life. It was no longer just longing, it was guilt, it was loss, it was raw regret. It was one random early morning, while sorting through some old boxes in search of a distraction, that Laura rediscovered something she'd forgotten existed. A small navy blue box, forgotten at the bottom of a drawer. Inside, the gift she'd bought months earlier for Daniel's birthday, a watch. She'd had a phrase engraved on the back, "With you, time is worth it." At the time, the phrase made perfect sense. But she'd never given the gift. And now, holding it in her hands, she felt as if time had mocked her. Because it was precisely time she hadn't known how to value. She cried right there, alone, hugging the object that represented everything she'd lost. And, on impulse, she wrote a letter. She didn't know exactly what to say, but she had to try. She placed the watch in the same box it came in, enclosed the letter, and sent it. She didn't ask for anything. She just said she was sorry. That if she could go back, she would have done everything differently. If time could still heal anything, she hoped it would at least heal his hurt. Days later, she received a package back. She recognized Daniel's handwriting. Her hands trembled. Opening it, she found the same box, the same watch. But something had changed. Inside, a short, direct note, cold as marble, "With me, time has moved on. May you now find your way." Laura broke down. That wasn't anger. It was the end. Absolute end. It was the final point she'd pretended didn't exist. Until that moment, she'd still maintained a silent illusion that he, somewhere, still loved her. But those words destroyed any trace of hope. Daniel was gone, not just from her home, but from her heart. And then, one night when regret weighed more heavily than sleep, Laura took a step she'd been avoiding for months. She went to the house of an old mutual friend, one of the few people who hadn't completely cut ties with her. She just wanted to vent, but she ended up hearing something she never expected. Her friend, with a grave expression, told her that Daniel had indeed rebuilt himself. He was happy, starting over. But she also revealed something that left her breathless. "You said he'd discovered the watch before anything else. That he'd known about the gift long before the breakup. That he'd found the box while organizing the house, weeks before the company dinner. And that he'd kept it secret. Because, even knowing about the loving gesture, he'd never received it." And there, in that oblivion, in that undelivered gift, Daniel understood she was no longer there. It was as if, unconsciously, she'd confessed her distance with that action. The absence of the gift was the presence of the truth. And he, who'd already been noticing the signs, found in that silence the answer to everything. But the revelation that completely destroyed her came soon after. Her friend hesitated, but then told her that Daniel had written her a letter weeks before the party. A letter in which he said he still believed, that he wanted to reclaim what they had, that he had found the gift, and that, despite the pain of seeing her so distant, he was still willing to try. But the letter was never delivered. Because, 2 days after writing it, he accidentally saw a message on Laura's phone. She had left the unlocked device on the table, and while Daniel was searching for a note, the notification appeared. It was a conversation with her boss. There was nothing explicit, but the content was undeniable. Emojis, ambiguous phrases, an intimacy that overflowed in every line. And then, he didn't deliver the letter. He didn't deliver the gift. And he decided to wait for the right moment to end the story. Dinner was just the final piece. He already knew everything. He had already felt the betrayal before he saw it. Hearing that, Laura froze. The undelivered watch, the unread letter, the discovered message, everything fit together with cruel precision. And the most devastating thing was realizing that, even then, there was still a chance. That Daniel, even injured, was still trying to save her. And that she, blinded by her desire for something new, had destroyed it with her own hands. Regret filled every cell. It wasn't just longing. It was the recognition of an unforgivable mistake. It was the certainty that she had lost someone who still believed in her, even when everything said otherwise. While Laura relived every detail in her mind, across town, Daniel sat in a cafe with his new partner. They laughed over simple things, exchanged calm glances, and there was a lightness in every gesture. He still carried wounds, but he had overcome them. There was no resentment, only maturity. He now knew he couldn't force anyone to stay. And, above all, he learned that love isn't insistence, it's reciprocity. He offered everything. She didn't know how to receive. And in that gift, never delivered, lay all the answers he needed. The past had finally ended. But for Laura, time stood still. Because understanding the depth of loss when there's no going back, is the true punishment. Months had passed since Laura and Daniel had last spoken. Time, for him, flowed with the serenity of a life that had found its bearings. For her, the days seemed drawn out, heavy, as if each dawn were another reminder of what had been lost. The letter that never arrived, the watch that wasn't delivered, Daniel's firm gaze as he refused to return it, all of it resonated in Laura's memory with the precision of a blade, cutting unhurriedly, day after day. She tried to move forward, but the constant feeling was of being trapped in a reality she had created, a labyrinth of thoughtless decisions, accumulated emptiness, truths she pretended not to see. Daniel now shared his routine with Isabella. A sweet woman with a calm soul and a steady gaze. Different from Laura in many ways, but with one characteristic he had learned to value above all else, presence. Isabella didn't fill the silence with promises or try to make up for Daniel's past with grand gestures. She simply stayed. She listened. She touched carefully. And that was enough. They lived a relationship based on the sincerity that springs from the rubble of a heart that had been wounded too much. And even though Daniel still bore deep scars, it was clear he had rediscovered something he thought lost forever, the peace of loving without fear. His steps no longer hesitated, his laughter no longer reticent. The pain, though still lingering in some corner of his memory, no longer dictated the rhythm of his days. It was on a warm September afternoon that the unexpected knocked on the door again. Daniel was sitting in a small cafe, reviewing some documents on his tablet while waiting for Isabella to leave a nearby doctor's appointment. The place was quiet, almost empty. As he looked up to order another coffee, he saw a figure standing hesitantly in the doorway. Laura. She was different. Her hair was shorter, her expression more sober, a kind of restrained sadness in her gestures that he wasn't familiar with. She walked toward him with careful steps, as if she knew she was invading a space that no longer belonged to her. She stopped in front of the table and, before he could say anything, asked if she could sit. Daniel hesitated for a second, assessing whether there was anything else to say, but then nodded slightly. She gently pulled out her chair and sat down. For a few seconds, the silence between them was almost awkward. Laura searched his eyes for some opening, some shred of affection that would comfort her, but found none. Only serenity. And that unbalanced her more than any indifference. She took a deep breath and began speaking bluntly, her voice trembling but determined. She said she wasn't there to beg for another chance, nor to try to justify what was no longer justifiable. She was there because she needed to tell the truth. The whole truth. Daniel remained silent, observing. Laura then told him about the watch, yes, but not only. She said that, weeks before the party, she had already begun to lose herself inside. That she felt something was missing and, instead of searching within the relationship, she searched outside. That there was never a plan, that everything just happened, and that the only thing she knew now, for sure, was that she had lost the best thing she ever had. She told him about the letter he wrote that she never knew about. And then, with discreet tears streaming down her face, she revealed what she hadn't told anyone yet, that even before the betrayal was consummated, she already knew she was no longer present in the relationship, and that the forgotten watch symbolized exactly that, her absence, her silent withdrawal. Daniel, listening to all of this, kept his eyes fixed on her, but inside, something stirred. Not anger. It was a kind of mature sadness, a pain that no longer hurt, but left a scar. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. He said he didn't need to hear any of that to move on, because he had already moved on. That he had forgiven, but not for her, for himself. Because carrying a grudge was like keeping a locked room inside his chest, where only hurt resided. And he had freed himself from that. He said he didn't hate her, but there was no longer any room for her in his life. That the love that had existed had been true, yes, but that it hadn't survived. And that, now, he was a different man. A man at peace. And then, without cruelty, but with a frankness that tore through, he added, "You didn't lose me on the day of the party. You lost me the day you decided to put the watch away." Laura wept silently. There were no more arguments, no more excuses. Just a void she'd carved herself. She apologized, not because she wanted to regain something, but because she needed him to know it hurt. That she finally understood what she'd done. Daniel looked at her with sad compassion. He didn't respond. He simply stood up, adjusted his chair, and said calmly that he hoped she would see him. And before leaving, he added, "Time is worth it when shared with those who never leave." And he left, leaving Laura there, alone, surrounded by memories that now had nowhere to live. Weeks later, Daniel and Isabella traveled to the countryside, to a small house he had bought with economy and care. A refuge. They planted a garden together, renovated rooms, and created new rituals. It was a new chapter, a book that began without the shadow of the previous one. The pain, now, was just a bygone story, and what he felt with Isabella was something that didn't need grand words to be understood. It was complicity, respect, and mutual choice. Laura, in turn, began seeing a therapist. She wanted to understand what had driven her to destroy something so rare. She began rebuilding herself, but this time without rushing, without expectations of returning to a past that no longer existed. Over time, she learned to live with the guilt and use the pain as a foundation to become a better person. Not for him. For her. And even if she could never erase what she had done, she knew that sincere repentance was the least she could carry with her. Their paths never crossed again. But on some distant night, under a star-filled sky, perhaps Laura glanced at the watch on her wrist, the same one she once bought for another man, and finally understood that time doesn't forgive those who don't know how to value it. Because some choices cost too much, and some losses are irreversible. That conversation at the cafe had been the end not just of a chapter, but of an entire era. When Daniel left Laura behind at that table, he didn't leave with his chest puffed with pride or his soul light like a hero who's won a battle. No. He left in silence, carrying on his shoulders a kind of exhaustion that only those who have loved with everything and lost completely can understand. There was something in her gaze that still hurt, not because he wanted to relive the past, but because she now seemed to see clearly everything he'd always shown her and she'd refused to see. It was no longer about wanting her to suffer, or to pay with tears the price of her choice. It was about realizing that that feeling that had once been love, then hurt, then silence, had finally turned into indifference. And that was true liberation. It was as if that encounter had sealed, once and for all, that what existed between them was now nothing more than a faded memory at the bottom of a book that would never be opened again. But none of this prevented Daniel from feeling a tight knot in his stomach when he returned home that night. Because forgiving isn't forgetting. And hearing, from the mouth of the one who hurt you, the true weight of what was lost inevitably provokes a kind of belated mourning. He lay down beside Isabella without saying a word, held her hand tightly, and stayed there, silent, as the ceiling seemed to spin above his head. There was no guilt, no doubt, just an empty nostalgia that wanted no return, but still knew how to hurt. Isabella, perceptive as she always was, understood the gesture. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand answers. He simply returned the handshake and remained there, present. And that was how, for the first time in a long time, Daniel understood the true value of loyalty. It isn't found in speeches or grand deeds, but in the silent steadfastness of those who choose to stay, even when it's not a day of celebration. However, for Laura, that day didn't end in simple silence. She returned home like someone returning from a bodiless wake. Her face bore the pallor of someone who understood too late, and her body the slowness of someone who no longer knew where she belonged. That empty chair in front of her, the note Daniel had left months ago, the watch with the phrase that now sounded like irony, all of it formed a bitter symphony within her. For days, she avoided the mirror. She began going out less. She cancelled appointments. Not because she was consciously punishing herself, but because something inside her had disconnected from the world. She had lost the man, yes, but more than that, she had lost herself in the process. She realized that, along the way, she had molded herself so much to meet external expectations that she had stopped listening to her own inner truth. She wanted to be more desired, more seen, more valued, and in her eagerness to feel important to someone, she destroyed the one who made her feel safe and whole. There was no longer any hope of return, and that didn't motivate her to pursue it. She had understood that, now, any attempt at rapprochement would be invasive, selfish, and disrespectful. Not because Daniel hated her, but precisely because he had learned to love her with such respect that he would never again allow her to occupy a space where she couldn't remain with dignity. The pain of rejection was harsh, but what truly tore her apart was having to live with the memory of who she had been, and what she had failed to value while there was still time. The weeks that followed were a kind of emotional desert. Laura began to question the meaning of everything. She felt strange even within her own home. The furniture, the objects, the walls, everything seemed to remind her of a time that no longer belonged to her. He began writing as a form of catharsis. I put everything I felt on paper, unfiltered, unashamed. I wrote letters I would never send, sentences that would never be read. It was her way of rebuilding herself, even if in pieces. She began attending a therapy group for women who had gone through painful breakups, not to feel less alone, but to understand the labyrinths the mind creates when we stop listening to ourselves. There, he discovered that her mistake wasn't just cheating on someone, but abandoning herself long before that. Meanwhile, Daniel and Isabella strengthened each other with simple gestures. An impromptu lunch midweek, a conversation on the porch during the rain, a lingering embrace after a difficult day. The wounds of the past hadn't disappeared, but they were no longer the focus. Isabella knew their past history, knew enough details to understand the man she loved, but she never asked for comparisons. She didn't take up anyone else's space, she created her own. And that was what Daniel admired most. There was no rush, no pressure. It was as if everything with her had a new rhythm, lighter, more honest. He allowed himself to be vulnerable, without fear of being less loved for it. And the more she welcomed him, the more he understood how accustomed he had become to the love that needed to be earned every day, rather than the love that simply lingered. One day, while sorting old boxes for the move to their new apartment, Daniel found the letter he'd written to Laura, the one he'd never delivered. He read it silently, sitting on the floor, surrounded by memories, while Isabella labeled books nearby. It was a heartfelt letter, full of hope, filled with silent pleas for her to return to being the woman he'd fallen in love with. When he finished, he carefully folded the paper, put it back in the envelope, and, without Isabella noticing, threw it into the fireplace they'd lit for the night. It wasn't a gesture of anger, but of liberation. The letter never arrived because it wasn't meant to. And now, not even he needed to know what he'd written. Across town, Laura spent the night with the TV on low, but not paying attention. She was beginning to accept that her life would never be the same again, and that she needed to build something new, even if she didn't yet know where to start. A friend invited her on a short trip, something simple, for a change of scenery. She accepted. It was the first decision in months she'd made without regret. During that trip, gazing at the ocean in the distance and feeling the cool sand beneath her feet, she understood that her punishment wasn't loneliness. It was the realization that, when she most needed to choose with her heart, she chose with her ego. And that there was no one else to blame for that. It wasn't a reconciliation, nor a punishment. It was a slow curve toward acceptance. Each had followed a path that no longer crossed. Daniel, with firm steps alongside a woman who loved him for who he was, not for what he could offer. Laura, with slow but conscious steps toward a more honest version of herself. There was, in both of them, a distinct maturation, born of chaos. And this maturation would soon bring a final answer. A final lesson. Something only time could teach. And that neither of them would ever forget. Time followed its course with the relentless tranquility of days that wait for no one. Autumn arrived with its yellowed leaves covering the sidewalks, and with it came new routines, new silences, new versions of each other. Daniel and Isabella had moved into their new apartment a little over a month ago. The space still smelled of fresh paint and possibilities. It was a sunny place, with wide windows and curtains that danced in the wind, as if the home breathed on its own. The objects were still being arranged, but the most important details had already found their places: the picture frame with a photo of the two of them smiling by a lake, Isabella's favorite book resting beside the bed, and a small plant that Daniel watered every day as if it were a secret symbol of the patience they had needed to cultivate in each other. They lived in a peace that required no explanation, but was sustained by gestures as small as they were precious. Daniel began working more at home, enjoying the tranquility of his new space. He felt his mind was cleaner, clearer, as if he had finally disconnected from the memories that still haunted him without permission. Sometimes, when he finished a project, he would close his laptop and go out to the balcony to watch the hustle and bustle of the street, the dogs walking with their owners, the sky changing colors in the late afternoon. These were common scenes, but now, charged with meaning. He understood that happiness wasn't found in moments of euphoria, but in the emotional stability of those who learn to recognize their own limits and respect themselves above any expectations of others. And Isabella was part of this without trying to take up too much space. She didn't push him toward the future, simply walked beside him with a rare ease, as if she knew that no love survives haste. She spoke little about his past, not because she ignored what had happened, but because she respected what it still meant. There was empathy in her eyes. And that was enough. Laura, on the other hand, was also beginning to rebuild something within herself, but from the wreckage she had created herself. After the trip with her friend, she decided to move house. Not because the place was cursed with memories, but because she needed a fresh start. She rented a small apartment in a quieter, less crowded neighborhood. A place that wouldn't echo her previous choices. She began to paint. Something she'd done as a teenager and had completely abandoned when adulthood swallowed up her time and identity. At first, they were just disconnected lines, abstract shapes, bold colors. But over time, the paintings began to tell stories, her stories, disguised as metaphors. She didn't show them to anyone, didn't seek approval. They were hers alone. For the first time in a long time, Laura focused on looking at herself honestly. And this, though painful, was also liberating. One Sunday afternoon, while walking through a craft fair, she happened to run into one of Daniel's friends, one of the few with whom she still maintained a tenuous connection. The woman greeted her politely, but with a certain distance. They chatted about superficial things, about the weather, work, and then the friend mentioned that Daniel had quietly gotten married weeks earlier, in a small ceremony, only for those closest to her. Laura felt a slight tremor in her hands, but maintained her smile. She nodded in thanks, and as she said goodbye, she took a deep breath. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was simply the shock of news that, despite being predictable, still struck a chord deep within. He had moved on. Definitely. He had taken a step that left no room for doubt. And now she needed to get used to the idea that the love she had destroyed was already in the possession and care of someone else. And that this other person wasn't the villain in the story. They were just the one who arrived when she had decided to leave. That night, he sat before the blank canvas and tried to paint. But he couldn't. For the first time in months, the colors wouldn't come. The lines didn't make sense. It was as if his hands were connected to a mind still digesting reality. He got up, went to the kitchen, made some tea, and stood looking out the window, feeling the silence of the house like a mirror. He thought about everything he'd experienced with Daniel, not to relive it or torture himself, but to understand. And he realized something he'd never admitted to himself: she hadn't just betrayed him with another man, she'd betrayed him by withdrawing from the relationship even while she was still physically present. By failing to notice the details, by failing to value the gestures, by choosing ego over surrender. And in that moment, he understood that the biggest mistake wasn't the final act, but the entire journey he'd silently traveled to get there. And this realization hurt more than any scolding, more than any rejection. Because it was then that he realized that life doesn't always give a chance to fix what was lost. Across town, Daniel was returning from the bakery with warm bread, while Isabella was waiting for him with coffee ready. The radio played an old song, the kind that lulls you into a quiet afternoon, and the smell of a full house filled the room. They sat together at the table and talked about trivial things, about a new series they could start watching, about next weekend's dinner, about the idea of adopting a dog. Everything flowed with a lightness he had forgotten and now rediscovered. And, without needing to say it, he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That the entire tortuous path he had traveled to get there had been necessary. Not to deserve Isabella, but to understand the value of a calm love, without shouting, without gaps, without urgency. A love that arrives and remains. At another time, Laura might have allowed herself to send one last message. A deeper apology, an attempt to say she had changed. But now, she knew it would only be a gesture to assuage her own guilt. It wasn't fair. Not to her, not to him. And so, instead of searching for the past, she decided to write to herself. A letter that wouldn't be sent. It began, "Today I recognize that I lost you before I truly lost you. And for that, I forgive myself." She placed the folded paper inside one of her unfinished canvases and walked out onto the balcony. The sky was clear, and a light breeze ruffled the leaves of the plants. She smiled, not because she was happy, but because she was whole. For the first time in a long time. The world outside continued to spin as always. But for both of them, there was now a new internal configuration. Daniel had transformed pain into wisdom. Laura had transformed loss into introspection. And what united them now was no longer the memory of a love, but the certainty that what is not cared for, falls apart. And that time, while not healing everything, reveals with precision who was present, and who was merely nearby. Daniel and Isabella's civil wedding night was simple, without spotlights, without grand productions, surrounded only by people who were truly part of their story. The ceremony was brief, but charged with profound meaning. Their "I do" was not just the formalization of a bond, but the materialization of a choice, choosing to continue even after it had been destroyed, choosing to trust again even after having seen that trust torn, choosing to start over with someone who wasn't asking to replace the past, but rather to build a new present. The looks exchanged at that moment said more than any speech. There were no promises of eternity, only a genuine willingness to stay side by side as long as their love was honest, as long as their loyalty was mutual. After the ceremony, they returned home as if returning from a normal dinner. Life with Isabella was like that: simplicity, comfortable silence, and a lack of urgency. What existed between them was a silent partnership, forged in listening, respect, and the patient building of true affection. However, a few weeks later, a local art exhibition caught the town's attention. Emerging, independent artists were invited to display their work in a public gallery. Daniel, who had always loved visual art, went with Isabella on a rainy Saturday afternoon, more out of curiosity than any expectation. They walked the gallery corridors hand in hand, commenting on the works in hushed tones, until, in one of the smaller rooms, he stopped before an abstract canvas, where strokes of red, black, and white intertwined like open wounds trying to close. The artist's name, written discreetly below, made his breath catch for a moment. It was Laura. There was something intimate, brutal about that painting. And Daniel, as much as he didn't want to admit it, recognized himself there. Isabella noticed the sudden silence, squeezed his hand, and looked at him calmly. He said nothing, just observed the work for a moment longer, then moved on. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't longing. It was simply confirmation that, even if on different paths, they were all dealing with its consequences. That same night, Laura, at home, saw on the gallery's profile that the painting had been sold. For the first time, one of her works had been purchased by someone she didn't know. She didn't know who it was, but the feeling was mixed, part pride, part emptiness. She knew that the painting was a kind of silent confession, a plea for forgiveness the world would never hear. She grabbed a glass of wine, sat on the living room floor, and cried. Not with deep sadness, but with acceptance. This was the closest she would come to redemption. She had lost the love of her life. Not through a momentary mistake, but through a series of small absences, silent choices that, together, created an irreversible abyss. And now she understood that, no matter how much she had changed, matured, understood what she had done, the forgiveness she desired would never take the form of a return. And that was something she could finally accept. Days later, Laura received an invitation to participate in an interview on a podcast about women who rebuilt their lives after life-changing experiences. She hesitated before accepting. She wasn't the type to expose her pain. But she understood there was something therapeutic in sharing her story, without victimhood, without self-pity, just with the necessary rawness so that others, perhaps, wouldn't make the same mistake. During the recording, with a firm voice, she recounted her journey, the ups and downs, the moment she lost her way, and the moment she realized it was too late. At the end, when the interviewer asked her what she would say to the Laura of the past, there was a long silence. Then, with eyes full of truth, she replied, "Don't confuse freedom with carelessness. Don't confuse desire with love. And, above all, don't betray the only person who never stopped believing in you." The interview went viral. Many women identified with it. Some criticized her, others understood her. But for Laura, that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had told the truth. For the first time, the whole truth. Meanwhile, Daniel and Isabella were planning a small celebratory trip. They didn't need lavish destinations, just quality time, away from their routine. They spent a few days in a country house, surrounded by greenery and the sounds of birds. On chilly nights, they sat together by the fireplace, sharing stories of the day, and talking about plans, children, and the future they now had to imagine. It was a silent love, built between the lines. Daniel no longer sought answers in the past, nor justifications for what he'd experienced. He knew that certain losses are necessary for one to recognize one's own worth. And now, alongside someone who didn't make him beg for attention or fight against disinterest, he understood how much love is also about being chosen every day, even on ordinary days. One afternoon, upon returning from the market, Isabella found Daniel sitting in the yard, with the dog they had recently adopted sleeping beside him. He was smiling, and there was a deep peace in his eyes. When she approached, he simply said, "You arrived when I no longer knew if there was still time. And you taught me that it's never too late to start over, as long as you start from the right place." She simply hugged him. Because some sentences don't need an answer. Just presence. Laura kept painting, kept writing, kept rebuilding herself. She never fell in love the same way again, and perhaps she would never love the way she loved Daniel again, but she understood that some stories serve to transform us, not to last. She became a different woman, not for him, but for herself. A woman who now knew her limits, who now chose more carefully what to give, and to whom. She had learned the cruelest way that betrayal destroys not only the other person, but also yourself. Because what you break in others inevitably breaks within you. And so, time passed. Each with their own story, each with their own scars. Daniel found true love again, not because he was rescued, but because he had the courage to rebuild. Laura lost the love of her life, and lived with the knowledge of it, not as a punishment, but as a scar that taught. Because some wounds, even healed, never stop reminding us of where they came from. And in the end, they both understood the hardest truth of all: love without respect is an illusion, and betrayed trust is like glass, even when glued together, it never becomes whole again. If you've made it this far, tell us what you thought of this story in the comments. What would you have done in Daniel's place? And Laura's? Your opinion is important for us to understand how this story touched you. And of course, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that will keep you hooked from start to finish. This story shows us that betrayal destroys much more than a relationship. It shatters trust, destroys homes, kills true feelings, and takes away what may never return: respect. Cheating isn't just a mistake, it's a choice. And every choice has a price. May this story serve as a reflection so that, before hurting someone who loves you, you consider whether it's really worth losing true love for a fleeting impulse. Remember, this channel does not support and never romanticizes any type of betrayal here. We tell stories that clearly demonstrate the emotional impact of thoughtless decisions. Thank you for listening until the end. See you in the next story. However, a few weeks later, a local art exhibition caught the town's attention. Emerging, independent artists were invited to display their work in a public gallery. Daniel, who had always loved visual art, went with Isabella on a rainy Saturday afternoon, more out of curiosity than any expectation. They walked the gallery corridors hand in hand, commenting on the works in hushed tones, until, in one of the smaller rooms, he stopped before an abstract canvas, where strokes of red, black, and white intertwined like open wounds trying to close. The artist's name, written discreetly below, made his breath catch for a moment. It was Laura. There was something intimate, brutal about that painting. And Daniel, as much as he didn't want to admit it, recognized himself there. Isabella noticed the sudden silence, squeezed his hand, and looked at him calmly. He said nothing, just observed the work for a moment longer, then moved on. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't longing. It was simply confirmation that, even if on different paths, they were all dealing with its consequences. That same night, Laura, at home, saw on the gallery's profile that the painting had been sold. For the first time, one of her works had been purchased by someone she didn't know. She didn't know who it was, but the feeling was mixed, part pride, part emptiness. She knew that the painting was a kind of silent confession, a plea for forgiveness the world would never hear. She grabbed a glass of wine, sat on the living room floor, and cried. Not with deep sadness, but with acceptance. This was the closest she would come to redemption. She had lost the love of her life. Not through a momentary mistake, but through a series of small absences, silent choices that, together, created an irreversible abyss. And now she understood that, no matter how much she had changed, matured, understood what she had done, the forgiveness she desired would never take the form of a return. And that was something she could finally accept. Days later, Laura received an invitation to participate in an interview on a podcast about women who rebuilt their lives after life-changing experiences. She hesitated before accepting. She wasn't the type to expose her pain. But she understood there was something therapeutic in sharing her story, without victimhood, without self-pity, just with the necessary rawness so that others, perhaps, wouldn't make the same mistake. During the recording, with a firm voice, she recounted her journey, the ups and downs, the moment she lost her way, and the moment she realized it was too late. At the end, when the interviewer asked her what she would say to the Laura of the past, there was a long silence. Then, with eyes full of truth, she replied, "Don't confuse freedom with carelessness. Don't confuse desire with love. And, above all, don't betray the only person who never stopped believing in you." The interview went viral. Many women identified with it. Some criticized her, others understood her. But for Laura, that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had told the truth. For the first time, the whole truth. Meanwhile, Daniel and Isabella were planning a small celebratory trip. They didn't need lavish destinations, just quality time, away from their routine. They spent a few days in a country house, surrounded by greenery and the sounds of birds. On chilly nights, they sat together by the fireplace, sharing stories of the day, and talking about plans, children, and the future they now had to imagine. It was a silent love, built between the lines. Daniel no longer sought answers in the past, nor justifications for what he'd experienced. He knew that certain losses are necessary for one to recognize one's own worth. And now, alongside someone who didn't make him beg for attention or fight against disinterest, he understood how much love is also about being chosen every day, even on ordinary days. One afternoon, upon returning from the market, Isabella found Daniel sitting in the yard, with the dog they had recently adopted sleeping beside him. He was smiling, and there was a deep peace in his eyes. When she approached, he simply said, "You arrived when I no longer knew if there was still time. And you taught me that it's never too late to start over, as long as you start from the right place." She simply hugged him. Because some sentences don't need an answer. Just presence. Laura kept painting, kept writing, kept rebuilding herself. She never fell in love the same way again, and perhaps she would never love the way she loved Daniel again, but she understood that some stories serve to transform us, not to last. She became a different woman, not for him, but for herself. A woman who now knew her limits, who now chose more carefully what to give, and to whom. She had learned the cruelest way that betrayal destroys not only the other person, but also yourself. Because what you break in others inevitably breaks within you. And so, time passed. Each with their own story, each with their own scars. Daniel found true love again, not because he was rescued, but because he had the courage to rebuild. Laura lost the love of her life, and lived with the knowledge of it, not as a punishment, but as a scar that taught. Because some wounds, even healed, never stop reminding us of where they came from. And in the end, they both understood the hardest truth of all: love without respect is an illusion, and betrayed trust is like glass, even when glued together, it never becomes whole again. If you've made it this far, tell us what you thought of this story in the comments. What would you have done in Daniel's place? And Laura's? Your opinion is important for us to understand how this story touched you. And of course, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that will keep you hooked from start to finish. This story shows us that betrayal destroys much more than a relationship. It shatters trust, destroys homes, kills true feelings, and takes away what may never return: respect. Cheating isn't just a mistake, it's a choice. And every choice has a price. May this story serve as a reflection so that, before hurting someone who loves you, you consider whether it's really worth losing true love for a fleeting impulse. Remember, this channel does not support and never romanticizes any type of betrayal here. we tell stories that clearly demonstrate the emotional impact of thoughtless decisions. Thank you for listening until the end. See you in the next story.